Hi everybody, and welcome to week 4 on Modernity and the Annihilation of Difference. This week we take an anthropological approach to unearth the cultural dimensions to genocide. As usual, here are our learning objectives. Let's start with reading 1, which is a review of Daniel Jonah Goldhagen's controversial book. This famous debate between Goldhagen and Browning played off a distinction in social psychology between cognitive/dispositional arguments like Goldhagen's and more situationalist arguments like Browning. Now I'll come back to this distinction next week when I introduce the relevant perpetrator studies literature. But for now, all I'll say is that this is a false dichotomy, and that, in a general sense, the perspectives of both Browning and Goldhagen are valid. Now, as we'll see, Goldhagen's conclusions are certainly problematic, but to his credit, his work urges us to confront the problem of explaining gratuitous public displays of mass violence. Browning's take on obedience theory only goes so far. It doesn't explain the violent excess we often see in genocide. Recall our readings from week 1 on genocidal rape, including Eliza von Judenforge's notion of life force atrocities. Of course, many perpetrators are quote-unquote ordinary men, but as we'll discuss further, ordinary people can commit extraordinary acts of violence. We'll come back to this in next week's reading by Dan Stone, whose theory of genocide as transgression uses the lens of cultural history to unveil the performative nature of mass violence as it works to reify the boundaries of collective identity. We saw this last week as well with Leanne Fuji on violent displays as a form of socialization. Notably, these are two scholars in our syllabus who were not trained as anthropologists, but nevertheless draw from anthropological theory. Goldhagen tried to do this as well, but fell short, as argued in this review article, which is authored by American anthropologist Alex Hinton, who gives him a pretty sympathetic treatment for drawing from symbolic, cognitive, and interpretive approaches to cultural anthropology. I briefly discussed these approaches in our doctoral seminar, including this methodology known as a thick description, which attempts to carefully dissect the convoluted layers of meaning behind social acts. Yet, despite Goldhagen's promise for such a treatment, his thesis fell far short. Goldhagen may have promised a thick description of the Holocaust in his introduction, but as it played out in the rest of his book, his thesis rested upon an impoverished conception of culture. In a nutshell, Goldhagen offers a monocausal argument that German political culture was the key factor in explaining the Holocaust. Not even a factor, but the factor. Essentially, Germans hated Jews and always have. He thus employs the concept of eliminationist anti-Semitism to identify this dominant cognitive model, a system of knowledge that was simply taken for granted by quote-unquote the Germans, sharing a single, overarching collective consciousness. As pointed out in this review article, and elsewhere in the literature, there are a couple of critical problems with Goldhagen's thesis. First, although widespread anti-Semitism was indeed an enabling condition of the Holocaust, any monocausal argument fails to adequately address the other dimensions of this genocide. Second, by simply referring to the Germans as a single unitary actor, and by asserting that this particular collectivity was defined by a common knowledge system, Hinton shows how Goldhagen tends to reify culture. The verb reify is very important this week. It means to take something that's inherently fluid and subjective, like identity and culture, and make it seem like it is, or should be, fixed and objective, as if they're products of nature and not artificial or socially constructed concepts. Hinton's review is especially critical of Goldhagen's so-called fax machine model of socialization. What assumption does the fax machine model make about the transmission of cultural knowledge? Are individuals like automatons who are programmed to respond accordingly? Is that what culture is? What is culture? To understand this, we need the tradition of cultural anthropology, which is strongly associated with this figure, Franz Boas, who was born in mid-19th century Germany and raised in a liberal Jewish family. Interestingly, Boas first earned a PhD in physics before immigrating to the US, where he developed an interest in the relationship between subjective experience and the objective world, especially with Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest. He began teaching at Columbia University, where he trained multiple generations of renowned cultural anthropologists, including some prominent female scholars like Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead. They were all in some ways outsiders to an academic world that was very WASPy, which is an acronym for white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, and male, of course. In the early 20th century, this was a world dominated by hierarchies. Racism and white supremacy were paramount. In this context, the new subdiscipline of cultural anthropology was revolutionary insofar as it conceptually undermined the highly ethnocentric and racist premise of social evolutionary theories that posited that all non-European peoples had to be judged in relation to the supposedly superior standards of the modern industrialized West. In particular, the Boasian concept of cultural relativism was underpinned by the normative principle that no culture is inherently superior or inferior. As a methodology, the relativist perspective is informed by a theory of historical particularism, or the idea that each culture has its own particular and unique history that is not governed by universal laws. In other words, cultural values and norms derive their meaning from within a specific social and environmental context. According to this nuanced view, culture can be defined as a shared, integrated, and socially learned system of knowledge, values, and patterns of behavior that are highly adaptive and mutable. Cultures are not static, isolated, autonomous, self-contained entities, but are rather porous, dynamic systems that change over time. Furthermore, unlike Goldhagen, we should be careful not to assume that culture is an all-powerful force on people's lives. Rather, many cultural anthropologists today emphasize the role of political and economic forces and other structural factors in shaping people's lives. And it's in this context that we can introduce the concept of modernity. Reading 2 comes from the same author, Alex Hinton. When he joined the field in the late 90s, there really weren't any other anthropologists in Holocaust and genocide studies. Now, that's changed a lot since then, although during the 1960s and 70s, some anthropologists engaged the genocide concept as part of a broader movement in indigenous rights discourse. That's more of a side note related to my own research. Our primary purpose with this reading is to introduce the concept of modernity, which refers to a set of interrelated historical processes going back to the 16th century, including the rise of the nation-state, the increased importance of the capitalist mode of production, and the replacement of quote-unquote traditional values and beliefs with quote-unquote modern dispositions, especially considering the rapid expansion of a materialist worldview and cultural habits. I'll come back to this point in the next slide, but for now it's important to understand how the discourse of modernity is underpinned by a meta-narrative, or a discursive structure is built around a series of value-laden binary oppositions. While thinking about how this conceptual schema has been invoked to legitimate genocide and other abuses, consider as well how this framework reflects the in-group, out-group dynamic that we discussed last week. Don't mind this slide for now, it's still under construction, probably for the next time I teach this course. For the sake of brevity, there are 2 key points to this slide. First relates to how the discipline of anthropology is implicated in the history of genocide, particularly by providing a legitimating ideology for the social destruction of so-called primitive peoples. This was a process of manufacturing difference, which I'll explain momentarily. Secondly, this slide also points to how colonial constructions were reproduced by post-colonial nation-states that not only inherited the political boundaries established by European imperialism, but also the intersubjective categories of identity that were used to divide and rule political subjects. For now, let's stay focused on Hinton's theory of manufacturing difference, which, like social identity theory from last week, helps us understand how the sharp boundaries are drawn between in-groups and out-groups. How are these artificial boundaries constructed to such deadly ends? It's important to note that this theory was used to account for the Cambodian genocide, where the victims and perpetrators came from the same national and ethnic group. If there was ever a case in which the in-group, out-group boundary was so artificially constructed in the paranoid imaginaries of the perpetrators, this is it. So how were these artificial identity-based distinctions made? This was a case where imaginary differences were reified and essentialized. And when it comes to identity, which again is inherently fluid and subjective, should be aware of any tendency that assumes that identities are fixed, rigid, and primordial. Again, group identities are not natural, but are rather socially constructed. That's the key lesson here. Our abbreviated reading by Zygmunt Bauman overlaps with the previous theory of manufacturing difference. Bauman explores how people get turned into quote-unquote problems. In my Native American genocides class, for example, I show how the language of the Indian problem was historically used before the advent of the so-called Jewish problem. In both cases, the notion that these peoples were problems necessitated certain quote-unquote solutions. We'll come back to the solutions part of this in the following slide. Anyways, the first part of our reading by Bauman works in relation to our readings last week on dehumanization, which is a cultural process often based on ideals of purity and pollution. These are common tropes, not just in perpetrator propaganda, but even in non-genocidal cultural systems. Both Hinton and Bauman referred to the British anthropologist Mary Douglas, who examined the meaning of dirt in different cultural contexts as a metaphor for social order. Hinton builds upon this theory by explaining how essentialized categories of identity and belonging are constructed. Bauman, meanwhile, uses this to inform his theory of genocide as social engineering, which we'll come back to in week 6. Looking ahead to our reading this week by Heather Ray, however, we should appreciate how metaphors of purity and pollution have been used not only to manufacture difference between in-groups and out-groups, but also to construct the political boundaries that define the modern nation-state. More on that in a second. Sticking with Bauman, if the previous slide looks at how groups become quote-unquote problems, then this slide looks at the so-called solutions. Bauman distinguishes between two alternative strategies for quote-unquote solving people problems. The first strategy is called anthropophagic. This is essentially another word for cannibalism, but it's used here in a figurative or symbolic sense, so that the social bodies of outgroups are devoured and consumed by the in-group through the process of assimilation. In other words, the differences between the outgroup and in-group are erased as the outgroup is incorporated into the social body of the in-group. The second strategy is called anthropoemic, and this is the symbolic vomiting of the outgroup through expulsion, whether through segregation, removal, or extermination. This distinction correlates with the conceptual difference between ethnocide and genocide. It's demonstrated in our reading by French anthropologist Pierre Clastres. I'm admittedly a bit torn on this reading, which is premised on an unreasonably narrow construal of genocide as a form of mass murder. We saw in week 1 that that's not necessarily the case. But the anthropological idea of ethnocide is of value, I think, in showing how different means can achieve the same end. Both genocide, strictly defined, and ethnocide are designed to annihilate difference, but whereas the former does it through violent expulsion, the latter does it through forcible assimilation. You can also compare this theory with our reading by political scientist Heather Ray, whose theory of pathological homogenization encompasses a broad range of increasingly extreme biopolitical techniques of population management, as seen here in this quote. Our reading by Ray also overlaps with that by Indian-born anthropologist Arjun Appadurai, whose work helps contextualize our contemporary era of globalization as a driver of mass violence. Basically, as increased global flows of peoples, goods, ideas, etc. challenge the borders and boundaries of nation-states, then this exacerbates anxieties about preserving ideally pure and homogeneous national communities. Violence can thus appear to provide a solution to such existential anxieties. The author here revisits the psychoanalytic notion of narcissism of minor differences, which originally derived from Freud to characterize conflicts between neighboring communities where differences were typically difficult to perceive. Once again, the public display of violence serves a productive function in crystallizing differences. Okay, and that's it. We have our usual assignments, of course. Please note that the first half of your annotated bibliography is due this week. Remember, you need at least 14 entries. That's it. Also, a quick word about our historiographical essay. For those of you who took the Doctoral Research Methods class with me this summer, you may recall our emphasis on narrowing down your research topic in question. Well, for this assignment, I want you to move in the opposite direction. Your lit review can be broad and expansive, searching for connections and larger implications. Indeed, your lit review will help you tease out the larger significance of your research project. Anyways, by now you should start organizing your essay. Remember to use the narrative strategies suggested in the syllabus. Contact me with any questions. In any case, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.